Representation is an act, state, or fact of representing or being represented in various forms such as images, pictures, demotic performances, mental images, presentations of views, facts, or arguments. In cultural studies, representation is not simply reflective of symbolic forms that exist in an independent object world, but is constitutive of the meaning they purport to stand in for. This means that the represented more than the represented object is given more importance. Representation is not just about representing material objects, but also about creating the representational effect of realism. It is crucial to understand the role of ideology, power, and politics in shaping the meaning and intelligent presentations. By studying representation, we can better understand the complex relationship between representation and the world around us. Barker's investigation of culture often involves the exploration of the processes of representation, which are essential in cultural studies. Culture is not just about representations, but also about practices and spatial arrangements. The process of representation makes practices meaningful and significant to us, as it is through the process of symbolization that we acquire and take out meaning from these practices and special arrangements. Representation is intrinsically bound up with questions of power through the process of selection and organization. To represent something, we cannot talk about everything about that object or phenomenon, even if it's a scientific phenomenon. We must be selective and organize it in a way that it makes it intelligible to people. It is the process of making things intelligible, making them significant, meaningful, and having value for us. Power is related to the way we select and organize things. And when we select and organize, we already have an ideology that propels us to select and organize things in a certain way to represent those things. The power of representation lies in enabling some kinds of knowing or knowledge to exist while excluding other ways of seeing. The moment you select something and leave out other aspects of it, you are engaging in a process of inclusion and exclusion. Representation as power is both inclusive and exclusive, as it is power or ideology that determines what is included and excluded. This is why representation is synonymous with power and ideology. Daniel Cavalero's book, Critical and Cultural Theory, provides valuable insights into the various aspects of representation important in cultural studies. He believes that there is a crisis in our understanding of representation, as there are ways in which representation has been problematized further. He discusses the importance of understanding cultural phenomena, philosophical perspectives, and ideology programs in studying representation. Human beings function in desperate cultural and historical contexts, and they feel the need to represent themselves and their environments. Different forms of representation exist in various fields such as cultural studies, sociology, anthropology, and literature such as biology, which refers to man as Homo sapiens, while other literature focuses on the inner life of man, passions, feelings, and moral dilemmas. Different forms of representation tell us about the societies, communities, and individuals that produce them. Understanding why different cultures have different forms of representation is crucial for understanding the complex relationship between representation and society. Cavalero's concept of representation is closely connected to the concept of repetition and the role of words in cultural settings. Words acquire meaning only to the extent that they can be repeated and used again in different contexts. The concept of representation and language can be seen as a complex interplay between words and cultural representations. His philosophical perspective on reality is that it cannot be accurately represented objectively because it is an effect of how it is perceived from various viewpoints. The world is not a given, but rather an effect of how it is perceived from various perspectives. Science provides us with a true picture, but in a philosophical sense, reality is an effect of how it is perceived from various viewpoints. Recent criticism has claimed that the real, as much as is attainable, and we only experience it through the mediation of texts, images, and stories. This acceptance of the fact that we cannot attain a holistic knowledge about reality is crucial, as the mediation is done through certain representational effects which come to us in representational forms. Representations work particularly in science, but they also play a role in the social, political, and cultural realm, where texts, images, and stories can seem natural for us. Cavallaro rightly terms this as a crisis in representation, a philosophical one, when we realize that we cannot have an unmediated access to reality and that reality is available to us only as effects. Representations are a vital means of supporting a culture's ideology. These representations, texts, stories, and images begin to stand for the real thing and are real to us. These things are circulated in a community, culture, or society, supporting a culture's ideology. The worldview invented by that culture to legitimate itself and discipline its subjects is deeply tied down to representation, as it becomes a vehicle of ideology through true circulation and constant repetition. Representations are vehicles through which we view the world and are invented by a particular culture. When representation becomes a vehicle of ideology, it legitimizes that culture and sometimes even shows that it is the best way things can be selected and organized to legitimate itself. Discipline is essential in this context, as it involves learning the codes of both encoding and decoding culture through representations and representational effects. Cavallaro emphasizes the importance of critical assessment of representations and their effects on a culture. This involves denaturalizing the cultural images and institutionalized responses to these images that surround us at all times. Institutionalized responses to dominant representations are also institutionalized, as we have learned the codes as per cultural people. These responses are learned through a process of institutionalization and indoctrination into the way we should respond. Dualism calls out to us to accept these representations as timeless and objective rather than timelessness, objectivity, or common sense. Cultural products can be approached as forms of representation, offering vital clues to a culture's belief systems. If you need to study any culture, including one, you need to look at any of its cultural products, as any text is a representation of what exists. A cultural product is a representation that tells us a lot about the culture where it comes from, particularly the beliefs, axioms, postulates, and interpretations of reality, and how it translates both factual and fictional situations into images. The power of representation lies in the selection and organization of things according to the ideology of the culture in which we live. This allows us to know in a Foucauldian way some kinds of knowledge to exist, which excluding with inclusion and exclusion being part of it. Selection and organization give power to the representation. Reality as such is unattainable, leading to a crisis in representation studies. We experience representation only through mediation of representation, understanding reality only through the mediation of texts, images, and stories. These texts, images, and stories themselves are representations as they seem more real. Andrew Edgar and Peter Sedgwick discuss representation in two ways. From the point of view of language theories, where representation becomes a function of language, they argue that representation is a representation of thoughts in language and a linguistic representation of the world of empirical experience. In social terms, representation can have a political meaning, such as pressure groups representing a group of people going to the government to submit a memorandum. Additionally, representation refers to norms and practices representing social groups, which are considered core cultural artifacts and everyday practices of a society. Stuart Hall's constructionist approach emphasizes the social character of language, moving away from the intentional school and focusing on the social aspect of language. This approach acknowledges that the material world and the symbolic or representational world are not the same and that meaning depends on the symbolic function of these objects. In the digital world, bytes are carriers of images, sounds, and other symbols, but the meaning depends on the symbolic function of these objects. Hall suggests that meaning through representation symbols is relational, as language is seen as a system of relations and arbitrary signs called works. The constructionist approach is now considered a more sophisticated account of representation than older approaches like the reflectionist and intentional approaches. Ontology is a powerful school of thought in philosophy that sees things as inherently having meaning or see things in terms of essences. The constructionist approach, on the other hand, is not ontological because it is a social, constructed, relational, and symbolic. In Stuart Hall's view, both representation and culture are about shared meanings. Meaning is an important concept in cultural studies, especially after the linguistic turn. However, meanings are not shared across cultures. Language is a representational system and the medium of perception and understanding. Hall's circuit of culture suggests that meanings are produced at several different sites, not only sites here, but also circulated through different processes and practices. This further problematizes and formulates representation, stating that meaning is constantly being produced and exchanged in every personal and social interaction. Meaning creation and an understanding of meaning or negotiation of meaning happens every. The circuit of culture highlights the importance of meaning creation and negotiation in everyday life and the importance of understanding the processes involved in meaning production and exchange. In addition to representation, the regulation of meaning is crucial in this circuit of culture. As long as we have ideology, power, and meaning will always be regulated by dominant agencies and challenged by people who challenge the dominant ideology. The components of Hall's circuit of culture include representation, regulation, identity, production, and consumption. Language systems work like languages because they use elements to represent thoughts, concepts, ideas, and feelings. Cultural studies is a non-ontological, non-mimetic, and non-reflectionist approach emphasizing the importance of understanding language systems as functions rather than being in themselves. Hall argues that meaning and representation belong to the interpretive side of human and cultural science as their subject matter cannot be easily measured and quantified. The anti-positivistic school of thinking versus the positivistic school of thinking believes that we can measure and quantify everything, while the interpretative school of representation asserts that is all and there is no one interpretation. Interpretation assures and argues that there can never produce a final absolute truth and there is also never a moment of absolute truth. Cultural studies of this interpretative kind or studies of representation are inevitably caught up in the circle of meaning, with any notion of a final meaning being endlessly put off or deferred. Chris Barker suggests that the problem of endless deferral of meaning can be addressed by moving away from an emphasis on representation. Instead of following the endless deferral of interpretations, we should recast the problems of culture, cultural studies, and cultural practices by moving away from an overemphasis on representation, particularly from a linguistic turn point of view. Instead, we should ask questions about the more mundane and pragmatic issues such as how to talk about X and for what purposes. Barker insists that we should take into account the many questions behind representation such as ideology, power, discursive practices, and politics. Instead of discussing representation in abstraction all the time, we should also ask about the purpose of our discussions about a phenomenon, event, or object. This can be a pragmatism, which involves asking questions about the purpose of our discussions about a phenomenon, event, or object. Language games, which are the use of language from a pragmatic point of view, can help us understand the meaning of cultural studies. By thinking of language from a pragmatic point of view, we can better understand the therapeutic nature of cultural studies. This therapeutic recasting of the question, what are cultural studies, into an inquiry about how we talk about cultural studies, allows us to see that cultural studies is not an object, but rather a way to understand and engage with the world around us. Misrepresentation is a crucial concept within representation, as it plays a central role in the construction of personal and collective identities. Hall proposes three approaches to representation: reflective, intentional, and constructionist. The constructionist approach is non-ontological, discussing representation, culture, reality, and knowledge as social, not individual entities. The circuit of culture, as defined Stuart Hall, refers to the system where representation, regulation, consumption, production, and identity are interconnected. Meanings are produced and differentiated through various processes and practices.